So in the second half of this course, we continue with Rails, but we're going to start bringing in some aspects of JavaScript. Some students in this course like to build the second project in a way where Rails is acting solely as a JSON API, and we're not using any of the Rails ERB views, and we're only using a JavaScript framework for the front-end views. And so, is it locked? And so I'm going to go a little bit over some of this JavaScript stuff. It's not just React and Vue that we need to cover. There are some sort of additions to JavaScript that you likely did not touch on when you saw JavaScript in WebDev 1 that we need to sort of get you up to speed on. I have shown this website briefly in the past in this class. This is the State of the JavaScript Survey, the 2019 edition, where they have surveyed like 20,000 different JavaScript developers. And if we just look it over again, specifically looking in the front-end frameworks sort of section, you can see the various frameworks that they are tracking here. React, Vue, Angular. Preact is just a sort of a re-implementation of React, so we could sort of bundle those two together. And then Ember and Svelte, which is sort of one of the newer frameworks on the block. And they've broken it down into the category of used before, would use again. So this is someone who's done development using a particular tool and would want to continue using that tool in future projects. And you can see here React is definitely the #1 player in that space. There is the used before but would not wish to use again. And so this is a bit of a damning response here. You can see Angular sort of leads the pack in terms of the used before but would not use again. With almost 36% of people saying they had used Angular but wouldn't use it. And it's not clear if they mean the most recent version of Angular or an older version. Angular changed quite a bit in its various versions. Then there's sort of the hype cycle questions like have heard of it and would like to learn. And so here we have Svelte, the sort of the new framework on the block, being the highest with 45%, followed by Vue at about 35%. And then heard of but not interested in learning, and there Ember leads the pack. Ember is sort of the oldest out of these established frameworks, and although there's still a very large and vibrant community around Ember, the sort of the development world is very, I would say, fashion driven, and we like our shiny new things. So when things become a little older and more established, people are less interested in using them, even if there are still valid and probably often really good solutions. And then there's just the straight up just never heard of it angle here. So typically in this course, I've only introduced Vue.js just because that was the one of these frameworks that I'd spend the most time in. I've spent more time now doing both React and Vue development. So this term I'm going to today give you a quick overview of both of these frameworks. And we're going to be doing it in the context of plain old JavaScript. And what I mean by that is that there are also sort of flavors of JavaScript that are becoming popular these days, where you write in this other language and it gets compiled down to JavaScript, because our browsers only understand JavaScript. So you could write in something like TypeScript or Reason or Elm and compile it to JavaScript for the browser. The most popular of these is TypeScript. You've all used TypeScript as terms in terms of being a user, in that we've been using VS Code, and VS Code is a web app. So VS Code is written in HTML, TypeScript, and CSS, and then it's wrapped with a project called Electron, which allows it to be distributed across multiple platforms. So it's a really neat idea of being able to take your web skills and then package applications that will run on Windows and Linux and Mac that are web applications. A lot of these things also have sort of corporate sponsors in a sense. So TypeScript comes from Microsoft. Microsoft is the sort of the reason being for TypeScript, and it's the corporate sponsor behind TypeScript. We're not going to dive into any of these, but it's worth knowing that they're out there and that there's some interest in them. The big thing that TypeScript brings to the table is types. So it's JavaScript, but with a stronger type system put in place. So it's strictly typed, or I think you can sort of bring in the types incrementally, whereas JavaScript proper is very loosely typed. In terms of the front end frameworks, the corporate sponsors here are React is created by Facebook, and Angular has Google as its corporate sponsor. Vue.js does not have a corporate sponsor. It was created by a single individual, Evan You, and it now has a whole open source team around it, but it doesn't have a large corporate backing. And some people see that as a positive thing, some people see it as a negative thing. So take it for what you will. We're going to use, instead of setting up in sort of our whole dev environment to work with this, I mean, we could do all of our development in VS Code, but it would probably take us a while to get all of the modules that we needed set up and the various extensions for VS Code set up. So we're actually going to use an online tool called Code Sandbox. So if you want to code along today, just head over to codesandbox.io right now and create yourself an account. I think you can sign up with, probably has some form of social sign up where you could sign up with your Google account or GitHub or something along those lines. I think I used my GitHub to create it. And then I will show you what it looks like internally. I will just pop into to one of these, maybe this one right here. So it's a complete development environment in the browser. It's got an area where you are writing code in the middle. It's got a file explorer over on the left. It's got a place where you can add JavaScript dependencies. So it has support for NPM packages built in, which is something else we would have to have set up if we were setting up a local development environment. So you can add dependencies over here and it manages them for you behind the scenes. And then the application that you're building is displayed on the right here. And as you code it in the coding area, it updates automatically in this little area here. And the really neat thing about this Code Sandbox, well, there's two neat things. One, you can just take this URL and share it with someone, and immediately they are in the same development environment. And so they can see the code, they can see the app running. But you can also take this little browser here, it's got a little URL, and you can copy and paste that URL and share it. And whatever you're making is instantly deployed to the web with a shareable URL. So the URL is not super human readable, but to get something out there and just to share it with someone, send someone a link to show them what you've been working on without having to think about deployment at all is super, super impressive. And so this is like a little to-do list application. I wrote this app twice during reading week, once in Vue.js and once in React, just so I would get a better sense of the differences between the two frameworks, and sort of building the same app in both frameworks gave me a chance to sort of compare and contrast the things that I knew about both of the frameworks, but that I hadn't really fully thought about in terms of what one does versus the other. All right, so I'm going to head over to my dashboard here. If you are in your Code Sandbox account, the first thing you want to do is create a new sandbox. And I'm going to start with a React example, and I'm going to use it to talk a little bit about component frameworks in general, and then I'll implement the exact same stuff using Vue, and then I'll go and implement a slightly more full-featured application using Vue itself, and then I'll share the React version of that code after class, because I don't think we'll be able to see the full larger application developed in React. But I'm going to create a new sandbox here, and you get a bunch of templates that you can start with, whether it's just like a vanilla JavaScript, there's no frameworks involved, or you're building Angular, or you're building Preact, or you want TypeScript or whatever. We specifically want just the React template. And so when we open that up, we get a little demo window that just says hello. Start editing to see some magic happen. I'm just going to move that a little bit off to the side here so we have a bit more room. You can see there's some dependencies. These are NPM dependencies, so that's one of the things that if you haven't done some JavaScript since WebDev 1, the idea of dependencies in JavaScript will be new to you. It's very, very similar to what we've been working with Ruby and the gem ecosystem, right? So with Ruby, we have a gem file where we list the various gems that we want to be installed. And when we run bundle install, that gem file is parsed and it fetches not only the gems that we have listed, but the gems that those gems depend upon, and then the gems that those gems depend upon, and it sort of fills out the whole dependency graph for us. The same thing goes in a modern JavaScript application where you have NPM dependencies. And so that's the node package management system. And so we have 3 dependencies here, or sort of 3 baseline dependencies: React, React DOM, and React scripts. And in Ruby, we have a gem file that lists those. Here we have a package JSON file. And so you can see inside of here, we've got some dependencies. There's the dependencies listed right there. And so if we were doing this development locally, we would use either the npm command line tool, or there's another tool that works with package.json files called Yarn, and we would use it much like we use bundle install. So I might type yarn space install at the command line. This package JSON would be processed, and then all the dependencies would be downloaded into a node modules folder. Online, we don't need to do that step. It just happens for us. Okay, some of the other things that we can look at here is we've got sort of a baseline set of files and folders. We have a public folder, and into that folder there is a index.html. And if we go and take a peek at what's inside of here, just open it up a little bit more. It's just a standard HTML document. If we wanted to change the title of our app, we could change that here. The only thing that really matters in this document, though, is this one div, where it has a div with an ID of root. The way that these JavaScript component frameworks operate is that they allow you to inject JavaScript apps into specific elements within a web page. So the React app that we're going to be building, it could just be injected into a part of a larger static HTML website. It could be injected into a part of a Rails-based website. In our case, it's going to be injected right into this div with an ID of root, and that's going to be the only thing in the HTML that we're sort of starting with here. You can see that other than the fact that there's like a no script tag. So if someone came to this website without JavaScript enabled, they would see that. But this is all the HTML that we're going to have inside of the actual HTML file. The rest of the HTML is going to be generated by way of JavaScript and injected into this ID root div. And where that happens, that's going to be happening over here in this index.js. We don't need to touch this file either. It's just been automatically generated for us. And I'll talk about this stuff in a moment, the imports above. But you can see here, this file is using the DOM. So it's going document.getElementById to find that div with an ID of root. So that's this div right here. And then it's going to something called React DOM, and it's saying render our app inside of that root element. And what is our app? Well, our app, which looks like a little HTML tag here, is being imported from another file. That's this file over here. And then we have 2 other import statements up at the top here. And again, if you are operating from sort of the WebDev 1 understanding of JavaScript, we don't have imports or modules covered in that course. And so these dependencies here, like React and React DOM, this is how we bring them into our application with these import statements. And so here I am saying import React from the dependency React and import React DOM from the dependency DOM. Those actually become objects inside of our code, and that's how we can go here to React DOM and call its render object. So this React DOM here is being imported from the React DOM dependency there. So we can import code from dependencies, but we can also import code from files that we have created ourselves. And one of those files that was created for us here that we're importing from is this app.js. So we're importing an app object from this app, which is in /, meaning like the current folder. And if we go to that app, we can see that it exports something called app. So for every export that you have in a file, you can do an import in another file. So this file here is exporting a default function called app, and that's being imported over in this other file so that it can be rendered into our root element. In this file here, we still need to bring in React because this is going to be a React application, and this might strike some of you as a little bit odd, but this is also where we import our CSS. And so we don't have a style tag or a link tag in the HTML here to bring in the CSS. The CSS is being brought in inside of our application. It's importing from this /styles.css file, which is right here. So you can see there's just some basic CSS inside of that file, and we can import it into our JavaScript application there. And then the app itself, quote unquote app here, is defined as a function that has a single return statement. And this is the part that always strikes people as a little bit odd when they first see something like React, is that this is a mixture of what looks like HTML and JavaScript. And so in this return statement, we're returning a div that has a class name of app, and inside of it, it has an H1 and an H2. That's exactly what we have over here. And if I was to take this app and open it in a different window here, and I was to go to my dev tools and I was to hover over things, you would see, even though it's not in the source code, right? In the source code, we just have the div with the ID of root. But in my dev tools, you can see that div with the class of app, an H1 that says hello code sandbox, and an H2 that says start editing to see some magic happen. That stuff is all coming from right here, and it's being injected into our application. Now, the whole idea behind React is that it is reactive. It is allowing us to make things that look and feel and act like applications. This is not so reactive. We could have accomplished the same thing by just straight up having this HTML in our index.html. So I'm going to add some reactivity in a moment. And then one of the things that you need to get used to, other than the fact that you can just embed HTML directly inside of a return statement like this, and notice it's not a string. It's not like it doesn't have quotes around it. I'm not just like embedding like a string that contains HTML. This is actual HTML, or in fact, not really. It's called JSX. And what I mean by not really is that it does differ in some very specific ways from HTML. One of those is that normally in HTML, when we apply a class to something, we use the class attribute. But in JSX, we have to use class name, where it's sort of camel cased with the capital N name. So that's a slight difference. And the other difference is that HTML5, you don't have to sort of self-close single tags, whereas in JSX, you have to. So JSX is a lot less permissive than HTML proper. So in HTML proper, I could start a paragraph tag, have some content inside of it, and the browser would just close it for me, even if I didn't close it. With JSX, though, that's not the case. So JSX is far less permissive than what a browser would allow in terms of valid HTML. So you can see over here, I've got an unterminated JSX contents, meaning I started a tag and I didn't close it. And so I'll have to close it like that. And same thing for like things like image tags, where you have to, like, it's just a tag and it typically doesn't have an end tag, while you would have to have like a slash to close it to make it something that is self-closing. So JSX is more akin to how we used to develop web pages in the days of XHTML, where XML and HTML were sort of put together into a language that was XHTML, which was, again, similar to this, very strict in terms of things needing to be properly closed. So those are some of the differences that you need to think about when you're thinking about JSX. All right, so I'm gonna get rid of some of this stuff here, and I'm gonna try to build out a little application that is reactive, that has some form of state. And that's also something that, if you think of a lot of sort of simple web pages, if they're just providing information, they don't necessarily have any state. And all I mean by state is like some variables that change their values at particular points in time. But with React, we do have this idea of state. Before React, we might have stored state in something like a JavaScript cookie or something like that, or we might have persisted all of our state on the back end and saved it in the database. With React, we can have a concept of state that is persistent to a certain extent, like it goes away if you were to reload the web page, but it persists while the page is open. And so what I would like to do is I would like to just put a little H1 in here that says React demo. And then below it, I'm going to put a button that says click me. And you can see as I'm adding code here, it's updating automatically over here, which is sort of a nice way to be developing. And I'm going to put a paragraph tag in here, and it says you have clicked n times. And eventually I want this n to be dynamically updating, so that as I actually click this button, that n, which would start at 0, would start to grow in its number. All right, just a quick show of hands. Who here has done some React programming already? Okay. Were you using React hooks, or were you using like class-based components? Both? Okay, so I'm not covering class-based components in this course. I'm going to go straight to hooks because that is sort of the new recommended style of creating components. For those of you who haven't done any React, that's a part of React that you can likely skip over and not have to worry about. If you end up working in some legacy code, you might see some components that were created with JavaScript's class syntax. But in this course, we're going to jump right to what's called React hooks, which is allowing our functions or allowing our components to stay as pure functions, and we can sort of layer some state into them using what's called a hook. And so I want a little bit of state to capture the clicks. And so what I'm going to do is above this return statement, so remember this whole thing is a function, and it currently just has a single return statement, but in any given function, we can have more code in it, right? You can do a bunch of stuff before your return. And one of the things we're going to do here is we're going to bring some state into the mix. And so I'm going to use the const keyword, and I am going to get myself access to a getter and a setter for a particular bit of state using something called a React hook, specifically the use state hook. And so up here, I have to say use state. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Oh, you are absolutely correct. It is. And here I am going to make a getter and setter for something called count. The word count is unimportant. That's just what I'm defining. I want to call it my state, right? So that is just like as programmers, we can always pick the names of our variables. This is the name of the state that I want to create. And then I'm going to use that state, and I'm going to give it a default value of 0. Now, as I said, as we're working through this, we're going to hit little bits of JavaScript that you may not have seen before, especially if you haven't worked with React. One of them was import and export statements. Another one is what's called destructuring. So if you look what's happening both here and here, we have some instances where we're getting data back and we're wrapping a variable in either a object or a array. And that is called a destructuring assignment. What's actually happening here with useState is returning to us an array of two things. But we don't want an array. We want to break that array out into two separate variables. And so the way you can do that so that you don't just get back a single array is in your assignment statement, you create an array, and inside of it, you put your two variables. And then after that point, whatever was returned at position 0 of the array that useState gave us will be in this count variable, and whatever was in position 1 of the useState array would be setCount. So it's a way of like taking a composite thing and destructuring it into multiple things. And so we now have a getter for count and a setter called setCount. And so state in React is considered to be immutable. You cannot change state directly. I can't go to this count and say count plus plus. The only way to modify count is to use the setter. So that's why these are both set up as constants, right? So I'm getting a const to a getter called count and a const to a setter called setCount. And that will give me the ability to both retrieve the count and modify the count, but I cannot modify the count directly. And then I want to inject that count variable into my application. And I do so inside of my JSX with single curly braces, sometimes called mustache braces. So you'll see people call this like mustache syntax because it looks like a mustache, right, on its side. And you can see here that it says now 0 times here, and that's because the state was initialized at 0. If I change that to 10, it goes to 10 times, right? And if I changed it to 100, it would say 100, but I'll start it back at 0. So that's a little bit of state that I've now brought into my application, and I'm using a getter to get that state and inject it into my JSX. And now I would like a little bit of state change, a little bit of reactivity, so that when I click this button, it's going to actually make that change. So that's going to happen right here on my button. I'm going to define an on change. And inside of more mustache braces, I could do one of two things here. I could put an anonymous function directly inside of here and have that anonymous function or callback function be executed when the button was clicked. Or I could just put the name of a function that I want to be called, and I could define that function up here, which again will seem a little bit weird. I'm going to define a function inside of a function. So this whole thing is a function with a return statement, and between where I'm defining my state and where I'm returning, I'm actually going to define another function. That's where I'm going to define a callback function. So I'm going to call this like button clicked or something. Button clicked. Yeah, let's not call that on change. That should be on click. And again, a little bit different from plain old HTML. We're using camel cased on click to set up this click handler. I'm currently getting a reference error because I haven't actually defined a button clicked function yet. I can define that up at the top here. So I'm going to say function button clicked, and I can now change its behavior. I can say set count. What do I want to change count to? Well, if I just wanted to change it to a specific number, like the very first time I click this button, it should change to 10, I could just call set count 10. And so when I click the button, it changes it to 10. But what I really want to do is I want to take the existing value of count, add 1 to it, and then use that to set the new state of count. So I could get that existing value of count, add 1 to it, and then send that off to send count so that every time I click this button, the value goes up by 1. And I can reload this page to get it back to 0, like that. I could even make another button if I wanted to, and that other button's sole purpose could be just to reset the count back to 0, right? So take a moment and try to do that yourself. Once you get this up and running, see if you can add another button with some text that just says reset, and when that button's clicked, it should reset the value of count to 0. So just take a few minutes and see if you can implement that, sort of copying what I did for the click event on the button that we have right now. And I'll just pause this for a moment. Let's quickly implement a reset button here. So I'm just going to put a button. I'm going to give it an on click, and I'm going to call it reset clicked, and I'm going to say reset count inside of the button. And then I need to define a function called reset clicked, which all it needs to do is go to set count and set it to 0. And so that way I can click a bunch of times, and then I can reset the count back to 0, click a bunch of times, and reset back to 0. Like so. I'm going to put one more little bit of state and reactivity in here just to show that it's not just things like clicks that can affect the change. There's all sorts of different events that we can attach behavior to. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put an H2 here that's just going to say mirror, mirror. And what I would like to do is I would like to have an input of type text, which is just the default for an input, and I want whatever I put in that input to be immediately mirrored into this paragraph tag below it, so that as I type into the input, the same text that I'm typing into the input would get mirrored down below. And again, notice the fact that I need to put a slash at the end of input. It needs to be self-closing, otherwise I'm going to get a JSX error saying I have unterminated JSX contents. So again, much more strict in terms of validity. So I'm going to bring a little bit more state into the mix here. I'm going to create a constant and I'll say text and set text. And I'm going to use state here to just define state as an empty string to begin with. So that is right here, const text, set text using state. And then I want to bind that state to both the output of the paragraph tag that's down below. I'm going to attach it to the value of the input as well, and I put an on change on that input so that when the input changes, it updates the text itself. So I'll say here on change, input changed is going to be the name of my handler. I can output inside of this paragraph tag below the getter for my text. So inside of my curly braces here, I've got the word text. That's just getting my getter up here. So if I change the initial state of that, we could see that reflected here because of the text. And if I go and remove that here, it'll change as well. And then I can define a function here. And this time the function needs to reference or at least get access to the input. because it's the input, I want to pull the value of the input into the function so that I can then use the set text to set the text. And if you remember working with just plain old JavaScript event handlers, they can optionally take in an event that gives you access to the event that actually triggered the thing. So I'm going to say input changed, and I'm going to take in as a parameter the event. And then every event has a target, the element that triggered the event. In that case, that'll be our input. And an input, to get its value, has a value property. And so I can use set text. That was my setter defined above with my hook. And I can go to the event target value. On change lead needs to be a function. It is a function. Input changed. Oh yeah, not in quotes. There we are. This is the reactive text. And then just to be sort of complete about things, I could also, I think, bind the value to the text. And that way text could be modified by other things, and the input could be updated as well. And what I mean by that is, for example, when we reset the clicked, we could also have that reset our little mirror here. So we could set text to a blank string, and that would affect not only the paragraph tag, but it would also affect the input because we've bound text to its value. So clicking that clears out both of them. And that was done again just by calling set text up inside of this reset clicked and ensuring that we had value set to text down below here. So that's just an initial demo of this idea of components. I haven't even gotten into sort of more of the complexities of the fact that you can like nest components inside of components, and you could pass properties from a parent component to a child component, or you can even pass like handlers, like callback handlers, down to children to have them send data back up to the parent. We're not going to get into any of those more complex topics today, but we have at least seen that we've created a single component. We layered in a little bit of state into that component with our useState hook. We were able to build some JSX, add some change and click handlers to the mix, and then output some of our state inside of HTML, or in this case, as a value of a particular input. Any questions, comments, or concerns so far about this style of sort of reactive development using a JavaScript framework? Again, if we went to our app over here, in the Vue source, none of this will be present, but all of that is present inside of here, inside of our little dev tools. And so like as we interact with the value here, you can see in dev tools getting highlighted what's being actually changed behind the scenes, which is pretty neat. And same thing goes for here. It seems to be one save behind. Oh, it's because this one's actually not saved. It was still taking my click handler as a string. There we are. And again, we could see that sort of updating behind the scenes here if we watch this stuff changing. A handy thing to have installed when working with React is that there are browser extensions. And so there's like the React DevTools extension that would give you access. I just don't have it installed right now, but it would give you access within your DevTools to another tab, which would give you the ability to sort of dig into and look at the state of your React component and nested components if you have them. That's a sort of a handy thing to have when working with these kind of component frameworks. All right, we're going to now create the exact same demo, but using Vue.js, and we'll just see some of the places where Vue differs from React and some of the places where it is quite similar. They both are quite similar in a lot of ways. Vue, like Rails, leans more heavily on magic. Things in React are very explicit and immutable, like you have these getters and setters to change your state. In Vue, you can manipulate state directly. It's not immutable state, and things are a little bit more magical around how things operate. And what that means is that Vue code tends to be shorter than React code, sometimes up to half as long in terms of number of lines. And again, some people see that as a benefit. They're like, oh, fewer lines, fewer bugs. And some people see that as a deficit, meaning that like you're relying on magic so that the code might not be as readable for someone coming to it for the first time. So I tend to gravitate more towards Vue because I sort of like frameworks that offer me magic, and I sort of like to have shorter, concise code. Other people like that more explicit flavor that's present in React, where you're sort of manually doing all the things that need to be done. And not relying on magic. You'll probably lean towards one or the other when you can sort of compare and contrast them. So I'm going to head over to my dashboard, and I'm going to create another sandbox. And this time I'm going to pick Vue from the list. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with React, is I'm going to just quickly go over the file folder structure, which is slightly different, and and the dependencies here. So you can see we have Vue as a dependency. We also have probably Vue CLI as a dependency, specifically Babel. Both React and Vue, when you write code in them, you typically are using Babel. And what Babel is it's a transpiler for JavaScript. JavaScript is standardized as something called ECMAScript. And there are improvements to ECMAScript that happen all the time, but they don't immediately land in all of the browsers at the same time. And you can have certain browsers that are stuck on older versions of ECMAScript, or you have companies that have sort of standardized on older browsers, and you might need to write code that still supports a very old browser. And so what Babel lets you do is it lets you write in the most modern version of ECMAScript, and then it will transpile your code down to a flavor of JavaScript that will be understood by even old browsers. And so this is actually happening sort of behind the scenes when you're working with these various frameworks, is Babel is transpiling your code. And you can either target specific browsers. You can say, I want to support, IE11 specifically, or, maybe you have some weird requirement to support like IE6 in some kind of bank that's stuck on that flavor of IE. But also with Babel, there are plugins that allow you just to target sort of what are the most popular browsers out there, including some legacy ones. So that's sort of happening behind the scenes. The other things that are happening sort of behind the scenes here, you might have noticed that when we work with our Ruby code, we have Rubocop that's doing some linting and some auto formatting for us. In the JavaScript world, we're using ESLint for our linting rules, and in the case of the setup with Code Sandbox, we're using Prettier as our auto formatter. And so these things are just automatically part of Code Sandbox. If you were doing this development on your own machine, you would have those things installed as extensions inside of VS Code. And so ESLint is sort of what's going to put little squiggly underlines under things, telling us that maybe we're doing something that goes against community convention or something that might lead to a bug. And the other thing is prettier. It's like, for example, if I leave off some of my semicolons by accident and then I save, the semicolons pop back into existence because prettier is rewriting my code on save to be sort of consistent in sort of the prettier style. So with a Vue project, just like with a React one, we do have a baseline index HTML. And it's the same kind of idea. Once this file gets set up, we don't really touch it beyond that. Whereas in React, the default is to have a div with an ID of root. In Vue, we have a div with an ID of app, but it's basically the same thing. This is the HTML element into which our app is going to be injected. And just like React, you could have a whole bunch of other HTML here. And so you could have a bunch of static HTML that makes up your website. And then you could have like a React or Vue component that's just one part of a much larger website. So you could have a bunch of HTML in here that define a much larger structure. And you could just target, this div, and that would be a piece of the puzzle that you were building out as your application. Again, in our case, it's going to be the only thing. We're just going to build our app and we're going to target this div. It's going to go into there. So we don't need to come back to that file anymore. There is a main.js. So in React, we have our index.js. Here we have a main.js. It's doing some of the same stuff here. So in the React version, we went and found our particular div and we rendered our component into it. This is the Vue way of doing that. We create a new instance of Vue. We're saying we're rendering our app, which is being imported from another file, and we're mounting it into, and this is how we target that div with an ID of app. We're just saying hashmark app, which represents like CSS sort of targeting syntax to say like target that div with an ID of app and put our app inside of it. So again, we don't have to come back to this file too often once it's set up. The thing you will notice is that at least when we're using what are called single file components in Vue, we're not creating .js files, we are creating .vue files. And Vue files are a mixture of three things. A Vue file has a template area, which is the markup for our code. It has a script area, which is the code itself. And then it has a style area where you can style your components, and you could add what's called a scoped property here, meaning that the styles would be only applicable to the component that you're working on. And so every component we develop in a Vue app where we're using these single file components has those three things: template, script, and styling. And so we're a little bit different from React in that we're not mixing markup with JavaScript. We're not going to have JavaScript and all of a sudden inline inside of that JavaScript is going to be HTML or JSX. Things are separated out so that our HTML is all by itself up in this template area. The scripts are down in here, and then styles are separated out. So it's slightly different in terms of how it encapsulates the different parts of our components. All right, I'm going to remove some of the stuff that is just default in here. So I'm going to leave my ID app here, but I'm going to remove the image inside of it. In the script tag, I'm going to remove the import statement because I don't want a separate component. And I'm just going to leave this export default as an empty object. And I'll just leave these default styles in place. We won't do too much in terms of styling today. So you can see that gave me a sort of a blank to work with here. Just like in our React app, I'm going to put an H1 up at the top and just say Vue demo instead of React demo. And I'm going to try to implement the same thing. So I'm going to put a paragraph tag in here that says you have clicked n times. And I'm going to put a button in here that says click me. like so. In React, we use state to set up our state. In Vue, what we do is inside of this object here, it's this main object that is the code to our component. And if we have state in our component, we set it up as a data property of this object. And specifically, it's going to be a data property that points to a function, and the function is going to return the base state of our application. And so the function is going to return itself an object, and inside of that object is our base state. And so we're going to have a count, and I'm going to set it to 0. So data points to a function, and that function returns the sort of the baseline state of our application and the initial state of any of our state variables. So here, count is set initially to 0. And if I want to display that count inside of our template, again, a slight difference here from React. In React, we used single mustache quotes. In Vue, we used double mustache. One of the things I found about Code Sandbox is that for whatever reason, when using Vue with Code Sandbox, it's a little laggy in terms of when it updates the associated example app. This is not present when I'm doing my work locally. So if I was developing a Vue app locally, that would have updated already. Here, it seems like it's not quite as nice in Code Sandbox when working with Vue, in that this area doesn't always immediately update. But here you can see it says we've clicked 0 times. If I have count initially set to 10 and I reload that page, glitchy McGlitch. What is glitched here for me? Weird. This is something that I experienced with the other section as well, is that although this Code Sandbox is lovely, it's not nearly as nice as having your own local development, because it does just sometimes straight up glitch out, right? Something is effectively broken right now, even though my code is correct. All I changed was my count from 0 to 10, but it doesn't seem to be working anymore over here, which is sort of lame. See if I just go back to 0. Change it to 10. Now, not exactly sure why it's glitching out, but we can just continue with the demo. It might just take a little while to catch up. All right, so I've defined a little bit of state. I want to do the same thing that I did in React World, is that I want to define like a click handler here on my button, so that when I click that button, that state will actually update. And so the way I do that in Vue is I create an @click. And here, this is one of the places where I continually mix up between the two different frameworks, is that in React, when we set up our handlers, we say onClick, and then we put the thing inside of curly braces. In Vue, we say @click, and we put our handler name inside of quotes. And so here I'm going to say like increment count. It's going to be the name of my click handler. and I define that in my script area here. Specifically, I'm going to, after data, put a comma, and I set up an area for some methods to be defined inside of their own object. So data is its own property inside of the Vue object, and now methods is another property inside of the Vue object right here. And inside of methods, I'm going to have my increment count method, which I'm going to define as a function. And this is the part of Vue.js that tends to rub React developers the wrong way, is that I have mutable state. And so I can just go and change this value of count directly. So I can just say this count plus plus. And this right here refers to, it's sort of a way of getting at this data. So by saying this count plus plus, that's going to increment count by 1, which will then update the count that's being displayed above here. And again, got a bit of a lag in terms of how things are operating, but there we go. So as I click, and so you can see you could very easily create your own little clicker style video games in this manner, because you have the ability to click things and change numbers. And so just like we did with React, take a moment and try to replicate what I did for this increment count click button to create a little reset button to reset the count back to 0. All right, I will come back and implement the reset button myself. So in my template, I'm going to add a new button, and it's going to say reset count inside of it. I'm going to give it a click handler that says @click equals, and here I could even just do an inline one, I think. Let me just see if that is a thing that I can do. Yeah. So you can do this in React as well. I didn't demo that when I was working with React, but sometimes when you have like a really, really short function, you can use JavaScript's arrow syntax, sometimes called like fat arrow or stabby arrow functions. Did you cover arrow functions or spend much time with them in WebDev 1? So they're an alternate way of defining a function. So instead of saying like function like that, basically the word function goes away and it's replaced with the stabby arrow. And so your parameters, if you have any, are still defined inside of the curly braces. And you can, if you only have a single line of code, you can also remove the curly braces. So here I have an anonymous function being defined that has a single line of code in it that's just setting count back to 0. So sometimes we will do things like that as a way of just quickly defining the function inline rather than going and defining a separate function inside of our methods. We could do one or the other, right? So now I've given you an example of both, where we have click me calling increment count, which is defined below here, but in the case of reset, we just have that inlined directly like so. And that's the whole reason behind arrow functions, was just conciseness. They also changed the way that things bind to this keyword, but at least in the way that we're using them right here, it's much more concise than writing out a full the word function. All right, I'll implement the next part of the demo here, which was just that little mirroring. And so I'll put an H2 that says mirror inside of it. And the idea here was that we're going to have an input and below it a paragraph tag. And you can notice that the markup that I'm writing here is much more permissive than what was allowed in JSX. So I can get away with not having a close tag on my input. But I believe if I was using Prettier's Vue rules, it would probably ask me to put one in anyways. Can't remember if that's one of the basic rules. Oh no, look, it just removed it for me, or maybe Prettier did that, or Vue or something took it away. All right, I need a bit of state, a bit more state, just like I did in the React example, where I can save the text that gets input in this input so that it could then be mirrored down below. And so I'm going to go to my data area because that's where my state goes. And I'm going to create something called text, and I'm going to give it a default value of just an empty string. And then here I can echo that text into my markup with my double mustaches. And then again, I'm going to use some of the magic that's available in Vue. So in React, we had to set up an onChange handler to, when the input changed, to manually set the state of this text variable. In Vue, because we have mutable state, I can just do what's called a vModel binding. I can just say vModel equals text, which just means like the state of this input is going to be bound in a two-way manner to the text variable. And that way, as I type code in my input, that gets mirrored below because of the two-way data binding that vModel affords us. Oops, no, I don't need Control S for saving, do I? It just saves automatically. And so you can see the code is not significantly shorter, but it is shorter than React just because of some of that magic, right? One of the reasons it's shorter is because I did an inline definition here for the reset. And then another reason it's shorter is because I'm relying on vModel to do the two-way data binding rather than having to define an onChange function and manually update my state. And so we've now seen the same demo implemented across two different component frameworks. Vue came after React, and so what Vue did is it actually took some ideas from the first version of Angular, the ideas similar to like the two-way data binding. It took some of the ideas from React, and it sort of tried to cherry pick what it thought was sort of the best out of the existing frameworks. If you go look at something like Svelte, which is sort of the new kid on the block in terms of frameworks, you can see that Svelte has gone to both React and Vue and Angular and sort of cherry picked the best ideas, or at least best according to the Svelte developers, the best ideas from all of those frameworks and put them into Svelte. And this is sort of how things tend to evolve in terms of open source projects on the web, right? One project influences the other, and what comes next tends to be an evolution or based on the best parts of things that came before. I haven't played around with Svelte yet. I've just looked at some of the examples that are up on the website, and I took a stroll of like a to-do app that was written in Svelte. It looks like a mashup of a bunch of these other frameworks, and it's getting quite popular, I think, because it has sort of removed some of the pain points that were present in some of the older frameworks and taken the best ideas. Any questions about Vue or React or component frameworks in general? So we're going to take a little break. I'll pause the video. We'll take like a break until a quarter after, and then I'll come back and I'll build a slightly more complicated application in Vue, and then I'll share with you the same code written in React. So we are going to create another Vue sandbox. So I'm back at my dashboard here, and I'm saying create Vue sandbox because that's the last one I created. If you don't see that there, you can just go to create sandbox and pick Vue. And then I have some CSS that we can use sort of as some starter CSS, and I've just put that up as a gist. So head over to gist.github.com/stungeye, and it's the very first gist that's being displayed. You just have to click on it, and then click raw, and then copy and paste that. So just copy all of that. So again, that was gist.github.com/stungeye. Very first one, click raw, and then copy and paste those styles, or at least copy them. Then over at your Vue application, when we open up the app.vue, we're going to paste the code in there. We're going to go to the style tag, we're going to remove what was in there, and we're going to paste in those styles. And then I'm also going to remove all the contents from my export, remove the import above it, and remove the two things up here as well. So I've just sort of stripped down my template to a single div. I've stripped down my script tag to a single export default on an object, and I've pasted my styles inside there. All right, so I want to set up a simple to-do application. It's going to have a single input into which a user can type a new to-do item they want to add to their to-do list. There's going to be a button for adding those to the actual to-do list. And then the list itself will be displayed, and there will be a way of like marking particular items as being complete or not. And so there is going to be 2 bits of state that I need to set up. And so I'm going to set that up inside of my data property. So I'll say data, which is a function that returns the state of my app. And the 2 bits of state I'm going to have is a new to-do item. That's just going to be bound to my input, so that as the user's typing into the input, there's going to be a V model that binds directly to this bit of state. And then I'm also going to have an array of to-do items, which will initially be empty. And that's going to be it for the state of this application. So it's going to be a variable to track what's inside of my input. And as we're adding items, we're going to be adding them to this array. So inside of my template here, I'm going to put my to-do list. And below that, I'm going to put an input. And I'm going to use vModel to bind it to my new to-do items state. And just to check to see if that's working properly, I will display the new to-do item down below. Oops, paragraph. Looking good. The font is super small down below, but at least we can see that that's operational. The V model is properly binding one to the other. I'm going to have a button that says add. There it is. And I want it, as I click that button, I want to take my new to-do item and add it to my array. And so I'm going to add a click handler here. I'm going to say when this button is clicked, I want to call a method called add item. My template got a little squiggly on it because that's because this add item has not been defined yet. Just trying to give myself a little bit more room here. There we are. Okay, so in Vue, we have data and we have methods. So I'm going to make my methods object here. Methods object. And inside of that methods object, I can create my add item function. And I could use a arrow function here if I wanted to as well. And so what I want to do is I want to get this new to-do item and I want to add it to my to-do list, which is just an array. And so in JavaScript, we can treat arrays like stacks, and they have a push method, and I can use that to push new items onto my stack. So I can go directly to this dot to-do items dot push, and a to-do item, I'm going to make it an object, a JavaScript object. That's going to include a few things. One of the things it's going to include is the text of the to-do item itself. And so I'll say item, I think it's not. What do I want to call it? Yeah, let's just call it text. That's going to be this dot new to-do item. So that's taking the current state of this variable here, putting it inside of an object and pushing that into my array. I also want a Boolean value to represent whether or not this to-do list item is done. And so I will give that an initial state of false. And then it could be really handy in all of these frameworks. When you have a collection of things, it's often quite handy to have a unique identifier for these. So if the data is coming from a database, it might be like UUID or something like that, or a primary key. I'm just going to save a timestamp, which is just going to be the current date. So just date not now, as a way of sort of uniquely identifying this to-do item. And then after my new to-do item has been added to my to-do list, I want to clear it out. Like I want to, like after I hit add here, click, I want that to go away so that I can put a new item in there. And so after my push here, I can go to this dot new to-do item and just set it to a blank string. So my total add item function now looks like this. I'm pushing a JavaScript object with text, done, and timestamp in it, and then I'm clearing out my to-do item. So that I do this, and I click add, it goes away. Now for debugging purposes, it would be nice to see if this push is actually working. And this is I'm gonna go and copy and paste my URL here. I'm gonna drop it in here. Give it a second. This is the glitchy part of Code Sandbox. What I would like to demo, let me just save this. Maybe that's why it's not working. What I would like to demo is just the Vue developer extension. So there's the React has a dev extension that adds to the dev tools. Vue also has an extension that adds to the dev tools. If you do a quick search just for Vue developer extension, you should be able to find the extension that fits your particular browser. So I'm using Firefox, so I would just say Vue Firefox extension. And I would get the Vue Dev Tools for Firefox. If you're in Chrome, you want the Vue.js Dev Tools for Chrome. And then if I come back over here, there's my application. That's running my copy and paste from this little thing here. So this is the app. If I go to my Dev Tools with the Control-Shift-I, there is a tab specifically for Vue. And what I can do is I can navigate to my application, and it actually shows me the state of the application. And I can manipulate that state directly. So I can go into this new to-do item, and I can change its value. And immediately that changes the state of my application. So I can like reach right into the state of my app and change it. Or as I change the state of my app in the application, I can see that reflected down below here. And so this will give me the ability to debug whether or not things are properly being added to my to-do list. So I can say like item 1. And if I click add, you can see that my to-do items has now an array of size 1. And if I expand the first object in it, the text is item 1. It has a timestamp. Its done property is set to false. I can set an item 2 in there and click add. And now I've got 2 items. And so it's really, really nice to have these extensions that allow you to debug the state of your application. So that just shows me that things are working well in terms of the state being updated how I'm expecting it to be updated. Now I want to display my to-do list below my input. So I've got the code already going to bind my input to my new to-do item. I've got the code going so that when I click add, I'm actually adding new items and clearing out the state of my input. Down below here, I'm going to want to display my to-dos. If I was working in React, I would use JavaScript to map over the elements in my to-do items and drop down little bits of JSX. In Vue, instead, we do not mix and match JavaScript in our markup. We use Vue directives, and I'll show you what a Vue directive looks like. So I'm going to put an ordered list here into which I can put my to-do list. And then inside of that ordered list, I'm going to put an li. So a list item. And I want this list item to be repeated once for every element that's inside of my to-do items array. And so there's a directive for that. Just like we have vModel as a directive, there's also a v_for as a directive. And so I can see v_for to-do, then I can say either in or of. They both do the same thing. To-do items. So this to-do items here is referencing my array of to-do items. v_for is saying create an li, one li for every to-do that's in to-do items. And then within the scope of this element, I'm going to have access to a to-do variable that has the contents of that to-do. So what that means is I could just, for demo purposes, just put the to-do items text property in there. What don't you like? V4. Oh, it wants a key. And that's why I have a unique thing. When I said it was handy sometimes to have a unique identifier like a UUID or a timestamp, when you loop over a property in Vue, it wants unique things to have unique identifiers. And so I'm going to set that up as what's called a key. And so I'm just going to say the key is the to-do timestamp. Something's still not doing what it should be doing. Error compiling template. Oh, I forgot my close on my OL. And as I add things to my to-do list and I click add, they are being populated down below by way of my V4. So looping over my to-do items, it's going to create one LI for each item in that array and will give me access to a to-do variable for each item through which I can get access to that to-do's timestamp for the unique key and the text to actually display the text in the unordered list or the ordered list. So it's, let's see what else I can do. Eventually I would like some way of flagging these items as being done or not, but I also would like, it's sort of a pain to have to always type something in here and then immediately click add. It would be nicer if I could just type something in and click enter. Currently that's not supported, but I already have a method that will add an item to my list. And so what I can do is I can go to my input right here and I can add something there as well. I can say on key up, and I'm adding this to the input specifically, on key up, and specifically on key up for the enter key, add item. And so now, when I say this and I hit enter, at the other thing, it just makes inputting that stuff into my to-do list all that much easier, and I'm just reusing the functionality that I had already declared. So I don't have to rewrite any code, I just bind it to a different click handler, or sorry, a different handler. So in one case, the add button has a click handler, and now my input has a key up handler, but it's only dealing with the enter key, which is, again, a really nice bit of magic that Vue gives us access to. The other bit of magic that I really like with vModel is it can be handy to trim white space off things. And so, you know, right now, there's nothing stopping like adding in an empty item into my list or an item that's full of a bunch of white space into my list. I can get rid of empty items quite quickly. I can say something like if, and I'm inside of the add item right now. I can say if this dot new to do item triple equals an empty, then just immediately return. Put a little guard statement up there. And so that means that although I can still put in items that have something in them, I can't put empty ones in, but I still can put ones that are full of spaces in. So I could, within this function, trim the contents. There's a JavaScript string property or a string method for trimming white space off of a string, but Vue also gives me a little bit of magic that I can use with vModel. I just have to look it up. Vue vModel trim. vModel.trim, Okay, that's an easy one. So I can do vModel.trim, and what it'll do is it'll just automatically trim white space from this property here. And so that as I hit enter, I can't put empty things in there anymore, and I shouldn't be able to allowed to put long empty ones in either. So that's handy. vModel trim. And now the last thing I want to do is to actually make use of that done property so that I can like flag things as being done. Maybe put a little check mark beside items, and when they're done, I can maybe put a strike through through the text, and maybe even like dim them out a little bit. And so I want to do that now, and I'm going to do that now by going inside of my LI. So I'm going to space my LI over multiple lines, and inside of it, I'm going to put a label. Wrapping my text. And inside of that label, I'm going to put an input of type checkbox. So that as I add items, I get a little checkbox beside them. But currently, the checkbox is not interacting in any way with the state of the item's sort of done property. And so I'm going to use vModel again to bind it to that little bit of state. And so inside my input, I'm going to say vModel. I want each of these checkboxes to have a two-way data binding to their associated to-do items done property. We can't actually see that doing anything just yet unless we go and take a peek at the Vue extension again. So if I go over here to my Vue application and I add a few items, this, that, the other thing, and I go and look at the state of the first two of them, you can see that they're initially set to false. When I click either the word this or the checkbox, that false changes to a true. So it's true now, and now it's false. True or false? Is it done or is it not done? Is it done or is it not done? And just to make that a little bit more apparent in the visual look and feel here, is I will put some strike through on the text. And I'm going to use a if statement to do that. And again, were we in React, I would use just a regular JavaScript if statement, or maybe I would use like a ternary operator. But because I'm in Vue, I have a Vue directive to do that for me. So I'm going to set up a del. I don't know if you've ever used the del property or the del tag before, but the default styling of a del tag is like strike through. So it means that something has been deleted. So I'm going to say del vif. So only display this del if the to-do item is done. And then inside of that del, I'm going to put the to-do items text. So is my del. And then I'm going to have below that a span, and I'm going to say velse. So otherwise, if it's not done, just display the to-do item text inside of span, which visually is nothing at all. Just a container to bind to that. And I need to put an extra quote there. So a little if-else statement done through Vue directives. So if the to-do is done, display the text inside of a del. If the to-do is not done, just display the text inside of a span. And now I can say this, that, the other thing. And if I click something as being done, it gets a strike through to represent that it's done. And we can continue to add features in this way, getting more and more complicated with the to-do list that we're building up. On Learn, I'm going to share a few things. I'm going to share a React version of this exact demo so that you can compare and contrast the building of this application in Vue with React. And you can see again that the two frameworks aren't so different, but the React code is slightly longer because you have to be more explicit about what you code in React. And the Vue code is slightly shorter because we're relying on some magic like the V model bindings and the auto trimming and the key up enter. There's a lot of little helpers that are giving us those capabilities. And then I'm also going to share like a very full-featured to-do list application, again written in both Vue and React, so that you could see what a very complete application might look like between the two of them. Does anyone need to see any bit of this code beyond the template here before we're done for the day? So there's the template, there's the script down below. So in total here, we've got about 41 lines of code. A number of them are like single lines for curly braces. If I quickly hopped over to the React implementation that I have of this code, we would see that the React version is about twice the length. It's like 82 lines of code, whereas the Vue version is, as I said, like, 41. So it's exactly half size Vue compared to React. And again, there's pros and cons with that. Smaller is not necessarily better, but in my mind, I tend to lump smaller code with fewer bugs just because of human error. So the more code you have, the more opportunity there is for there to be bugs in the code. A number of years ago, NASA did a giant audit on all of the code that they were supporting and all of the code that they were writing, and they were looking for what was the cause of the bugs in their code, what correlated to bugs in their code. And the only correlate that they could find across all of their code bases was number of lines of code. That was the only thing that they could find that was directly correlated to bugs, was lines of code. So there is something to be said for a framework that allows you to code the same functionality in fewer lines. But again, the opposing argument is that maybe that code, because of the magic, is less understandable to someone who is new to the framework because they have to pick up all of the conventions. And so the way we're going to continue in this course is I'm going to continue presenting ideas in both React and Vue, and it's going to be up to you if you want to use one or the other or neither in your final project. So the final project can be coded completely just in Rails alone with Rails-based views. If you want to bring in a component framework, you can use React or you can use Vue. I would recommend using the one that you gravitate to the most. Although if you've already got a bunch of React experience, you may want to leverage that experience and continue on in React, or you might want to explore Vue just to get an experience in a different framework. So it's going to be your call as to sort of where you want to take that part of the final project, if you want to include JavaScript or not, or which of the two frameworks that I presented that you want to actually use. And if someone wants to use Angular, they could as well, but that's something that I could provide zero assistance on because I don't know Angular. So you'd be on your own, even though that would be fine if you really want to use that, because it would be interesting for me to see a version of the project that included Angular. All right, that's all I got for you for today. Thank you very much for coming to class and listening to me talk about JavaScript component frameworks.